Hello and welcome to Big Deal. Today, let's get chatting with British International Investment, which has a net portfolio value of about $2.2 billion in India. And let me welcome on the show Nick Donohoe, who's the Chief Executive Officer at British International Investment. Nick, always a pleasure to welcome you on CNBC-TV18. On your India visit, what are the key themes that you are focusing on and how has been your visit so far? Let's begin with that.
Yes, well, I've been in India all week. It's been a great visit so far. BII, as you know, is the UK's development finance institution owned by the UK government. So our priority is we've got, I suppose, what you described as a dual bottom line. On the one hand, we want to invest in India. We want to earn returns in India. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're having a really important influence on overall development in India. So whenever we look at investments, we look at both these, both a financial and a development impact case. I think in India specifically, there are two sort of, I suppose, very broad themes that we're interested in. One is the climate transition. And obviously, this country will need an enormous amount of capital to transition and meet its net zero commitments. So we're looking very closely at things like biofuels. We're looking at the whole EV space, whether that's manufacturing or whether it's building infrastructure. So we're looking at agriculture. We're looking at adaptation, resilience within agriculture. And the other big theme is inclusion. I mean, almost whatever poverty line you draw, India still has more people living below that line than any other country in the world. So there are still enormous challenges in terms of whether that's financial inclusion, whether it's access to health, whether it's access to education. So we're looking at all those where the private sector, because we're a company that invests in private sector companies.
You spoke about several themes that you're interested in. And yes, your focus has been development finance based on sustainability as well as impact approach, Nick. So that's a very differentiated area. You recently invested in Mahindra & Mahindra's EV business. Tell us more about that particular investment and also what is the potential of growth of this investment because of which you've made this investment.
Yeah, no, look, I think for us, that's obviously one of our larger investments in India, and our commitment to Mahindra was $250 million. And really, and I talked earlier about the challenge of climate transition in this country, and a huge part of that transition will be moving to electric vehicles. Mahindra obviously are one of the largest vehicle manufacturer in this country, and we wanted to partner with them to do what we could to help accelerate that their entry into that market and accelerate their transition to becoming a leading EV manufacturer. We're very pleased recently to see Temasek join us in that investment with their commitment to Mahindra.
That's right. And Nick, it's a big investment for you. And when we talk about sustainability, you did mention the energy transition bit. Now, which side of the debate are you on when it comes to the energy transition and the cost that is involved in that transition for many of the old economy companies? And also, on the other hand, who bears the cost of the change and the energy transition because it comes with some bit of investment?
Yeah, look, I think we have to accept that the climate change challenge is really the greatest challenge for our generation and the next generation, and we all have to play our part in that transition. And I think what we see certainly from companies, and that includes the sort of older economy companies, is a real willingness to adapt their business model and adapt their business processes to become more energy efficient, to rely more on renewable energy. And so I think it's not a sort of a zero-sum game. There is a real incentive, I think, for everybody and for every company to play its part, and we see, I mean, obviously that will need finance. It will obviously also need some support from government. and we're seeing governments in all the countries in which we invest provide levels of support. But yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. I think it's a win-win for everybody.
That's right, and a long-term solution to many issues in the world, Nick. And we all are working towards that. What are the key themes globally that are developing, especially in energy transition, the future of clean energy, as well as sustainability parameters right now? Give us a sense of that, because you have an overview of so many developing themes and topics across the world.
Yeah, so look, I think the key themes are in renewable energy are how we can move and transition to green, away from fossil fuels into green generation, particularly in power. We obviously have solar and wind have become very well established in many countries. Hydro is already very well established. So it's how we move on past those and explore areas and they're not equally relevant in every country. I think the other key themes are the transmission network. We will need to, renewable energy tends to be much more fragmented in terms of its generation. And we'll need to, in most countries, we need to make huge investments in the transmission networks in order to both take on and distribute the energy that we produce. And so I think that's probably been, to some extent, has been an overlooked area. And then I think, the whole transition through in mobility. So electric vehicles, we're playing, as I said earlier, a big part here in India, both for example, as you mentioned, by supporting Mahindra, but on the other end of the spectrum, we've invested in companies to do, for example, battery swapping for 2- and 3-wheeler vehicles. So that whole theme of how do you build the enabling infrastructure, the EV infrastructure, to allow that transition to electric vehicles. So those are some of the broad area of adaptation and resilience. So it's not just about changing or becoming a greener economy, but it's also about adapting to what will be an inevitable rise in temperature of 1.5 degrees, possibly more. That has big implications in India. Adaptation and resilience, how that's going to be paid for, what is the role of government, how much of it is effectively needs to be done through the public sector and our public goods versus how much can be done through the private sector. We're investing actively in climate tech broadly to help try to develop new solutions to help companies and households better adapt to, as I said, what will be an inevitable change in climate. So I think those are some of the key themes in our markets.
Right. So, Nick, you touched upon several very interesting and very important points, and things are evolving on that particular front. How do you see India on two specific points that you mentioned? First of all, the energy evacuation, so the right transmission lines and having the infrastructure. And the second, the battery for the EV space and EV mobility, that needs proper infrastructure, which we are still in the process of building. And it's also a costly affair, and adoption will also depend on how reasonable it is, because India is a very price-sensitive market. In your view, how is India right now positioned on these parameters, and vis-a-vis the world, where do we stand right now?
Yeah, so look, I think on the transmission side, like almost every other country in the world, there is significant investment needed. A lot of that will have to obviously come through the public sector, but significant investment needed in building, not just building new transmission, but also building transmission that's more flexible and can allow for more intermittent power, which is often the case with many forms of renewable energy. So that is important here. I think on the EV infrastructure side, that's an area where we've been frankly more directly involved. And I think today, as far as I understand, something like 1 to 2% of 3-wheelers in this country are electric. That's obviously a very small percentage. So there's enormous potential for that to increase. Today, if you're driving a 3-wheeler, it's still somewhat more expensive to buy an electric vehicle. But on the other hand, once you own or lease the vehicle, then the operating costs are smaller. So it's an attractive proposition for owners, but only if they can access power when they need it. And so I mentioned Battery Smart is a company that we've invested in that does battery swapping in multiple locations. So the drivers bring in their batteries, they swap them out, and they put in new ones. That's a much cheaper proposition for drivers than buying a vehicle with a battery. So those are the sort of things I think that those sort of networks, those sort of companies need to grow very rapidly to meet the growth in EV vehicles themselves.
Right. Are we matching up with the demand and adoption? In terms of adoption, where are we, Nick, very quickly?
Well, my understanding is it's something like 1 to 2% in terms of adoption of EV. I think in three-wheelers, it's about 1 to 2% of the vehicles in India today are electric. So it's a very small percentage.
We have a long way to go on that, and development finance from firms like yourself are also really giving that support and growth capital for this particular space. Nick, hold on to your thoughts. There's much more we want to discuss with you right here on Big Deal. So after a very short break, stay tuned.